Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the last lecture in the Critical Issues Confronting China series, as well as our PRC at 75 series. I think many of you here are concerned with what is the state of the Chinese economy. And so we have really somebody who is a longtime expert focused on Chinese firms and Chinese economy here today to speak on the topic of what happens after the Chinese miracle. So in the title itself is a bit of a prediction about what's to come. The era of high-flying growth is over, but what follows after that. So it's my pleasure today to welcome our speaker, and Stevenson-Yang. She is the co-founder and research director of J Capital Research, which since 2007 has been one of the leading firms looking at the state of Chinese companies and both what's happening inside China itself, but also as they've moved out to become multinational corporations. She has been a regular contributor to Forbes, so I think many of you who read that publication regularly will see her pieces in there. Besides having been a founder of J Capital Research, she has lived in China on and off since 1985. She has founded several other firms, including in publishing and software and in online media as well. And so certainly she has a long arc view of the state of both the Chinese economic miracle as it unfolded and what might be the next stage for China's economy. Our discussant today, I think, needs really no introduction to this crowd, but in case you're not familiar with him, this is Professor Tony Saich, the director of the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia, as well as the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs for the Harvard Kennedy School. So please join me in welcoming Anne Stevenson-Yang to the Fairbanks Center.
So I'm supposed to say something. Now I'm nervous because I was expecting like 3 people, and and not a microphone and stuff. But at any rate, I'll just like talk and please interrupt me because I enjoy interruptions and questions. But let me just begin with a sort of historical perspective. So I first went to China in 1985, and I thought at the time that it was pretty like different and opening up and that I'd missed all the excitement, but in fact it was really just beginning. So in the 1980s, China, as you know, Deng Xiaoping pretty much walked out of jail and into Zhongnanhai and started, through some factional politics that we need not go into, started, reforming China and opening the economy. And in a way, the 1980s were sort of a Gandhian rural revolution. So there was a lot more fermentation and opening in the countryside and the establishment of township and village enterprises than initially in the cities. And you had these little openings in the arts where you started to have more music and poetry and political analysis and things like that, because there were different regimes for foreigners than for Chinese. And it eventually became, it pretty soon became difficult to sort of determine who was foreign and who was Chinese. Like, for example, I had a perfectly white Irish background friend who wanted to go live in Beijing. So I pawned her off as an in-law of some of my family in Beijing. I was married to a Chinese guy, and so they let her live in a Chinese neighborhood, which at that time was not permitted, and rent from a Chinese family. That was the kind of thing that started to happen. So, for example, Cui Jian, the rock star, played concerts at the Spanish embassy. You could see foreign movies at like 7 in the morning by invitation at special theaters. And gradually, these barriers became more and more porous until you started to have this sort of, efflorescence of the arts, where you'd have shows of expressionist painting in the parks or in people's apartments. You'd have concerts, you'd have poets passing through, and everything starts to sort of open up and blossom, including business. And then you have 1989. And after 1989, then you had sort of 3 years of freeze where the government is trying to keep control of everybody. And they did a lot of studying of what happened in 1989. And the Chinese government was really, really afraid of what had happened in the Soviet Union and the crack up of the Soviet Union. They issued all these studies of that, and they tried to figure out how to avoid that. So after 1989, after sort of the military clampdown and the police clampdown, they began to reform the system in ways that would give the central government more control. So the tax system, the customs system. In 1995, they passed a labor law which made it possible to leave your danwei and no longer be followed around by this file and choose your employment. And they sort of set free what became sort of 350 million people who were wandering around the country for work. They had this open city program, which had actually begun in 1983, but became much bigger, where they had designated cities like Shenzhen and Zhuhai, where people could migrate and work in the factories. So for the first time in 40 years, people were leaving their homes and going to work in the coast, and they lived in dormitories there. So you had this reform of labor. You had this, and then the central government invested a whole lot of money in what they called the golden projects, which were technical projects to invest in trade, customs, taxation, golden shield, which was, security and protection of the country, in order mainly for the central government to get better vision into what taxes were being collected and how to, manage their bureaucracies. I had meetings in the early 1990s, for example, with the Labor Bureau, where I'd be sitting in the office of the guy, the head of Social Security, and he'd get a call and he'd say something like, "Oh, really? You didn't hear about that regulation? Oh, wait, I got to get this call from Tibet. Oh, Tibet, have you implemented this? You haven't gotten it? Oh, let me mail it to you." That was the degree of coordination. I remember when Tony, I think, was head of the Ford Foundation, right? When they were trying to import, at that time there was like a 300% import tax on cars, and they were trying to import a car tax-free, right? And instead, the Customs Bureau, and they actually got a document that was signed by the head of the Customs Bureau that said they're an NGO, they're allowed to import this car tax-free, and they bring it to customs and they say, "We don't report to him." So they, it was a very sort of disorganized thing. So the central government was trying to sort of get control over all these things, and at the same time invest in and pour out money to all of the provinces. So at the time, Li Peng was the premier, and all of the localities loved Li Peng because he basically was a hands-off premier. He was basically like, whatever you want to do, just go ahead and do, and I'll fund it. So they all loved him. So it was kind of go-go time, except the central government was pouring money into exerting more control over the localities, and it had a lot of side effects. One of the important side effects was that the central government beginning in 1995, started to collect all the taxes and then remit portions of the taxes. Initially, the same amount that the localities originally could keep, they would remit that amount of taxes back to the localities. But gradually, the portion that they remitted reduced, and also it had to, China has 4 levels of government. So the central government is at the top, and they would drop the tax, the amount of taxes that they were remitting on the provincial level, and then it would go down to the city, to the county to the town, and by the time it gets to the town, there's nothing left, right? Because the province decides it needs an airport, and the county decides it needs to build a new road, and by the time you get down to the lowest level, there's no money left, and they're the guys who have to fund the schools, right, and the hospitals and stuff like that. So gradually, the balance of tax revenue between localities and the center got a lot less favorable for the localities. You also had a period when the central government decided that they were going to limit the amount of land that people could develop, and also they wanted to take the burden of providing, housing and all these other benefits off the shoulders of the state-owned enterprises. Because at the time, state-owned enterprises were essentially cities unto themselves. I mean, if you went into the, Shougang complex in Beijing, which made steel, they had their own TV station, they had their own hospital, they had their, clinics, they had their own kindergarten, they had their own everything. There was one guy I met who worked in the meteorology bureau in Beijing who had never left. There was a woman that I met on an airplane once whose name was Xiaodian, because she was born, which means little electricity, because she was born in a power plant. And she never left the power plant until she was like 25 or something, because these things were huge and they were worlds unto themselves. But for this reason, the state-owned enterprises, for the most part, were not making profit because they had to carry all these social burdens. So the government started to split those things off, and one of the biggest things was to privatize housing, so that the state-owned enterprises no longer had to provide housing to people, and the housing that was already provided, you had to hold it for a certain number of, you could buy it from them at a very low price, hold it for a certain number of years, and then sell it. So the central government's restrictions on developing land constricted the availability of land for development, and then the state-owned enterprises reform of housing made housing more available. So you started to have this, pressure on housing, and a housing market began. Then the second problem that was sort of presenting itself was this lack of financing for localities. So the State Development Bank, now called the China Development Bank, came up with this idea in about 1998. Oh, well, they need more money. So what they could do, these local governments own the land. What they can do is they can collateralize the land, and we'll give them loans, and then they can do whatever they want. So the localities thought, oh, this is a great idea. So we're going to collateralize our land and borrow a lot of money, and then we can build stuff. So among these, the land pressure, the availability of financing, the demand that's released from the state-owned enterprises releasing housing, all of this creates this sort of crucible in which the housing bubble begins. So you have all of that. And then another of the reforms in the late 1990s, I hope I'm not scrambling all of this for you. Feel free to stop me. Another of the reforms was to break apart financing from administration. So it used to be that if you were the Ministry of Machine Building, you funded all of the machine building companies under you. But this became frustrating for some of the ministries that didn't own that many companies or didn't have that much money. So in particular, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which didn't directly own companies, was coming up with all of these technologies, and they couldn't get them funded to start companies, and they got really frustrated. So they helped start this system where you had little equity groups. The first one was started under the state, what was it called? SSTC, State Administration of Science and Technology, or something like that. And Deng Xiaoping's daughter was there, and this other leader, Chen Yi's daughter, was in there. And so they had the sort of bureaucratic clout to get this started. And they hired the son of the Minister of Labor, and they started this thing called venture tech, which became China's first private equity company. And so venture tech started to fund some of these ideas out of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, like Henan was one of them. It was the first cell phone company. There was Lenovo, this guy who was from CAS, who was running around selling IBM computers, but looking for money to seed his own company. So he seeded what was then called, it wasn't called Lenovo, it was called Lixiang. What was it called? Anyway, it was called something else. And he got money from venture tech to start this company that distributed computers and eventually manufactured computers, and now is a huge company. There were a lot of companies, most of them are dead now. Venture tech started freelancing because they basically had too much money, so they started freelancing in like golf courses in Henan and all these different things, and they eventually blew up. And Zhu Rongji, who had taken over as premier, closed them down. But they were just one of many, and you got to a period in the early 2000s when basically every national leader had a child who headed a private equity company, because private equity, in any country really is all about connections. So, and in China it's hyper connections. So everybody had a child in private equity. And so, if you wanted private equity to fund your company, then you'd go to one of those. But at any rate, so they came up with this way of unstringing bureaucratic authority from financial authority. They came up with a lot of innovations on that too. So initially there was something called the umbrella company, because initially under the Chinese system, devised under Mao and not really changed in the 1980s, you had every factory, every office, every administrative unit was a separate entity. So you didn't have any cross-provincial companies. You didn't have, if you had a factory and you wanted to have like sales in a different province, that didn't happen. That was by a different company. So you had these things called umbrella companies in order to form a sort of bridge. And then that morphed into the group corporation, where companies could manage their own financial, if you were making money in these two provinces and you were losing money in that province, you could pool and you could show a net profit, across the different companies. So that a little bit went wild, but you developed companies that became very large based on that. So all this time, the central government is continuing to invest. The property bubble is inflating more. Things are getting a little bit out of hand, and then you come up against the 2008 Olympics and the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, what the Olympics did were to, around the Olympics, China greatly tightened its concerns about national security and its scrutiny of international visitors to China and things like that. So China was very, very concerned about having the Olympics come off smoothly and presenting an image to the world that would be positive and not having anything disturb that. So you had things like, quotas distributed to each city for arrests, so that they would not have any like undesirable people on the streets. You had much heightened surveillance. You had suppression of the news. For example, this was the period when there was a milk company that put melamine in their milk, in their baby powder that makes milk, and you had at least 7 babies die from consuming that milk, but the information was suppressed until after the Olympics. There were a lot of events like that. And so the central government is investing heavily in these security systems. They're focusing heavily on the Olympics, and they failed to notice in 2007-8 that their exports are starting to weaken and that the international economy is becoming weaker. So then at the end of 2008, you have this sudden sort of seizure of the international crisis, right? And so Chinese leaders are watching on television as people from I don't know, Bear Stearns, like, walk out of the building carrying their desk in a box, right? And they're terrified. They're terrified that this explosion of demand. Oh, and I forgot to mention the 2001 entry into the WTO, which really, really spurred exports. So China, all through the first decade of the 2000s, is seeing this explosion in demand, explosion in exports, explosion in investment because of the property bubble. And then they're terrified that it's all going to go away because so much of their economy is dependent on the international economy. So they decide, okay, so what we're going to do is invest heavily domestically so that we're no longer dependent on the international world. So the word goes out from the central government in like late October of 2008, and they say to all the provinces, bring us your wish list. Whatever it is you want, that's what we're going to approve. And the wish lists that came in were something like, I don't know, 50 trillion or some ridiculous number like that. And the central government ended up approving on the order of 14 trillion of these things. And in the end, they didn't fiscally invest in any of these things. It was all financed through loans. So the banks were just, released to lend whatever amount of money these projects wanted. So they went on this crazy building spree. Initially, infrastructure, so train lines, highways, airports, and there were a lot of white elephants in this. There were airports that never got any flights approved. And there still are airports that get 2 flights a week in summer and then close down during winter. There was pressure to spend more money, to invest more money, but not necessarily efficiently. So for example, there's the fast train line between Beijing and Tianjin. They spent, it was already like 200 kilometers, 200 kilometers an hour, and they wanted it to be 300 kilometers an hour. And that was going to require 200 million per kilometer in new investment. But that was fine, so they raised it that. But it turns out that the trip 200 kilometers an hour from Beijing to Tianjin only takes, 23 minutes. But you need to use 10 minutes to speed up and 10 minutes to slow down. So it turns out you only get 3 minutes at 300 kilometers an hour. So was it really worth it? But that wasn't the question that was asked. So there was tremendous amount of money spent on these things. At the same time, and localities, the central government is saying, oh, well, we want to invest in e-commerce. So the local governments don't really have e-commerce, but they need to sort of catch on to the national idea about e-commerce. So what they do is they build logistics parks for e-commerce, which really are sort of real estate projects. Same thing happens with EVs and batteries and whatever the technology of the moment is. That's what the localities, go for. And they can't really, if you're Western Hubei, then you don't really have an auto industry. Maybe you do because of the Maoist third line thing. You have a little bit, but it's very inefficient, right? So the national mandate comes out that you need to build electric vehicles. So you build an electric vehicle park, right? And then the electric vehicle companies that exist, you say, well, I know that you're not really going to move from Zhuhai or from Wuhan is maybe more realistically if you're in Hubei, but why don't you just we'll give you a lower tax rate if you run all your receipts through us. So you would be, maybe you set up a little office in the Western Hubei Park, but mainly you continue to have your operations in Wuhan, but you run all of your, sales receipts through the Shiyan, or whatever it is in Western Hubei. so that you get a lower tax rate. So Western Hubei shows a higher GDP, but it doesn't actually have any new activity. That happened all over the country. So you have these mandates coming down from the central government that you need to show this number or that number, and the localities are incented to achieve it whichever way possible. So as you can imagine, there are all sorts of abuses and problems that come from this. For example, the central government might say, well, we really want lots of solar energy, solar panels. So we want you to produce as many solar panels as possible. So the locality will then, maybe it doesn't have any particular reason to have a solar business. So they'll say, well, you know what? We're going to give you really, really cheap coal to make the solar panels. So, move your factory here. So then you'll get a little solar panel company that will move here. Or maybe, the central government says, okay, enough of these industrial solar panels. Let's have solar rooftops. So we'll put a subsidy after solar rooftops. So they do that, but then all these businesses start up that know how to arbitrage the subsidy schemes so that they capture the subsidies without actually building the solar panels for rooftops. You had this in industries all over. I studied the hog industry for a little while, the slaughterhouse industry. So there was a period when China really wanted to centralize and consolidate its slaughterhouses for pork, because the pork business then was like, and I'm talking like 2009, 10, that sort of period. You'd go to Hebei, where most of the pork industry is located, and you would find these guys with trucks who would drive around to the hills and buy hogs from farmers, and they would buy like 10 hogs, right? And then bring them to the little local slaughterhouse, and there would be these guys with knives that would as a vegetarian, I nevertheless followed this industry, so you should admire that I did that. But anyway, so this was basically what the industry was. So the country wanted to make this more efficient, so they said, okay, we're going to subsidize big slaughterhouses. So you had all these companies that would basically, you're a guy in Chang'e, Henan, and you go to your local, machinery manufacturer, and you say, hey, look, I can get all these subsidies for building a big slaughterhouse, so why don't you give me like $1 million of equipment, but give me a receipt that says $100 million, and then I'll give you personally $1 million, right? So that's a much better deal than trying to actually build a slaughterhouse. So that's what happened. So you had all these companies, like there was one that I followed called Zhongpin, which whose ticker was HOGS, hogs, that did exactly that. And so they put in all their documents. Oh, well, this slaughterhouse cost us $100 million, when actually you'd go there and you'd see these guys with knives, like, driving 10 hogs off a pickup truck and then slitting their necks and picking their feet up with a chain. That was Zhongpin. So anyway, you had all of these abuses, and of course, the more investment, the more abuse. So you got this, phenomenon, particularly in the early part of the second decade of the 2000s, of these ghost cities where, because everybody is incented to create new cities and to therefore, create more industrial activity. At least that was the idea, sell more. So you had this dynamic where if you were a locality, you had a piece of land that sort of belonged to you, and the land is, maybe you grow lemons locally, right? So, but the land technically belongs to you because you're the communist government. So what you do is you have, let's say, 10 acres of land, and you go to the local guys and you say, you know what, sell me your land and I will give you clean new apartments in a high rise, and you're no longer going to be an agricultural worker, you're going to be an industrial guy. That means if you're an industrial guy, that means that your children get better access to school, you get better access to pension and to health, And you don't have to like sweat in the fields anymore picking lemons. Isn't that great? So the guy said, and I'm going to give you $10,000, which is more than you've seen in cash your whole life. So of course that's a great deal. So the guy says, sure. So you're the locality, you've spent $10,000 times 10 for these 10 acres, right? You move everybody to 1 acre. You upgrade the land to residential land, so now it's worth $100,000 per acre. You get a developer to come in and buy the land, and as part of the deal, they build you a high-rise on this 1 acre that's left. Great deal for everybody. The problem is, no more lemons. You've gotten the developer to fund this high-rise for a little while, so the guy who sort of sweeps the high-rise and runs the elevator and all that, they have salaries for a year or two. But after that, what happens? You don't know, because you've already moved up to Beijing because you've achieved your local your local requirements, right? So this is what's happening. That's a micro view of what's happening nationwide. So it kind of, it explodes through 2011, 2012 it teeters. From 2012 to 2020, or when COVID begins, 2019. It kind of like flatlines, but they keep on like stimulating a little bit more, putting in a little bit more money, and then letting it flatline for a while, and then putting in a little more money, and then you come up on COVID, and they can't really do that anymore, and now the economy is just doing this. So it's a sort of rambling way of saying what's going on now, but part of this is to say that there was a lot of confidence by international companies and investors in China for a long time, because there was so much spending on, Gucci bags and, nights at the Hilton and airline trips and, international travel. And you'd see all of these, foreign universities, Chinese students are paying for all of the other students, right? Because they're paying full freight. You go to Paris and there's a line of Chinese people outside the Gucci store. You go to Edinburgh and they're all over every single city, capital in the world, Chinese people are spending all the money, right? But most of that money came from capital gains. So it was, for like on the lower end, it was local governments buying land. So if you were, a resident of some small town in Ordos County in Inner Mongolia, and you sold your land to the local government, oh great, so you could move to Hohhot and get an apartment. If you are, if you're flipping real estate in Beijing or Shanghai, then you can maybe move to Hong Kong on the $1 million that you made from that. If you are an investor, or you took equity in a small company, and now another company has taken 25% of your equity at 100 times the valuation, great, you can take that money and move to Vancouver. So that was the nature of Chinese spending. Salaries didn't go up that much. I will stop there. No, that's all right, but I'm just rambling, so.
What happens next? What happens after the Chinese miracle?
I mean, one can never be sure, but yeah, go ahead. Well, I mean, this is in my day job. What I do is look at such companies on the stock market. But the fact is that Chinese companies that have listed in the U.S., yes, they get prosecuted by the SEC and even sometimes by the DOJ. But then they just, go home, and nobody in China really cares about it very much. So you had big frauds like Longtop Financial, which delisted in about, 2011 or so. But that they delisted after the chairman admitted that they didn't have $1 billion that they claimed to have in cash. That was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But they just delisted and then started again a company called Giant Stone, because, so those companies, Chinese companies listed overseas, fall into this weird regulatory gap. Chinese companies listed in China, yes, can get in trouble, but there's an awful lot of fraud on the Chinese exchanges too.
Great. Let me, because we won't have time for questions, let me make 4 comments, the last 2 of which do relate to what happens next. The first one relates to the trying to get around the import tax on the car. And 1 or 2 of you heard me tell this before. The document that actually legitimized Ford Foundation's operations in China was signed off by all the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, 5 of them at the time, including Zhao Ziyang. But I was never allowed to see the actual document that set up the basis on which we could operate in China. But somewhere in there was the fact that we were tax exempt. But every year I had to go to the National Industrial and Commercial Bureau, the Beijing Industrial Commercial Bureau, and then the Chaoyang Industrial Commercial Bureau to get them to ratify the fact that we would be tax exempt. But I had to do this without ever being able to look at the document which guided what we were doing. So when I eventually one year got to the Chaoyang district, there was a very smart woman there, and 1 or 2 of you heard me tell this story before. She said, "Oh, so you're not allowed to read this document?" I said, "No, I'm not allowed to read this document. It's a state secret. It's held in the safe in the Chinese Academy. I'm not allowed to." She said, "Okay, but it doesn't say you can't hear the document, does it?" And I said, "No, it doesn't say that." So she read Article 1, and she just read her whole way through the document. And so we were able to confirm our tax-exempt status. And then we went through customs, as you said, and eventually got the car without the huge tax on it. 3 quick sort of comments. I think one thing in terms of foreign perceptions of China, I think we saw what we wanted to see, particularly through the 80s. And I think we underestimated the residual strength of the traditional state system. And I think in the 80s and even going through the kind of go-go 90s, I think we sort of felt that was going away, but it wasn't. It was still there as a really strong core. And as China became richer and as China felt it was sort of turning the corner on a lot of its challenges, I think that kind of core of the party state, desire for control, desire for management, really came back again very much strongly to the fore. And of course we see that now with Xi Jinping, but I think it had been there for a long time and we tended to ignore it. 2 comments relating to kind of looking forward. The first is, it's quite clear that the model of development that China had operated, that you were talking about, with a lot of great examples, had really reached its limits of what was possible. And so that debt-fueled growth, the export-led growth, really had run its course. And it's been talking about that since 2002, 2003. If you look at comments by Wen Jiabao, Hu Jintao, they're all saying we need to shift this model of development. The fact it's never been able to do that just shows how politically difficult it is actually to achieve that over time. And one thing that the new leadership has not done is they're not willing to shift to a consumer-driven economy, which is what a lot of people think they should do if they want to have long-term sustainable growth. Instead, they're reinforcing the kind of state-led investment, and of course what we're hearing about high quality growth and investing in the technologies of the future. That's all well and good, but it's based on a security and kind of national power framework rather than what is going to be beneficial long-term, both for the economy and also for many members in society. And I would point out, 2 things sort of related to that. The first is most people in China do not have the qualifications or capabilities to participate in a high-quality growth economy. We've got 700-800 million people still in the countryside, relatively low levels of education. They're not going to be able to participate in that economy. The second is it's going to put tremendous pressure around China's exports because it's going to be producing those goods in overabundance, which they're then going to want to export. And it's not now just the US, but I think a lot of other countries are going to start increasing the barriers to those exports. A European Union already with electric vehicles, but I think another number of other countries will also put up barriers, which again is going to make it difficult for China to achieve its growth perspectives. I can't really see in realistic terms the Chinese economy growing by more than 2 or 3% if it carries on with the current strategy. It might not even reach that. The last thing I just want to say is the impact of the Trump administration. And that is going to have a major impact on whatever happens next for the Chinese economy. Now, China, as you rightly say, saw these fears already back in 2008, 2009, so was really already trying to reorient its focus. And we have the ideas of dual circulation, reduced dependence on externally, greater circulation within the domestic economy itself. But and of course, one of the questions is which Trump is going to turn up. Is it going to be Trump, the deal maker, where putting on 60% tariffs is to try and force China to change some of its industrial policy and come to a phase 2 trade agreement? Or is it the Trump who really wants to crush any potential competitor? And if one were to put in place 60% tariffs, some of the figures I've seen is that would reduce potentially China's GDP growth by about 1.5%. And it's also going to tremendously impact and cut down on its export capabilities and capacities. So I think one of the challenges then for China moving forward is, can it develop effective alternative export markets, and can it develop enough consumer demand and consumption domestically that will allow it to kind of survive those external shocks? And I don't think we really know the answer to that. So with that, we have plenty of time for comments and questions. I think there's a microphone in which we would encourage you to make your comments. And please feel free, let us know who you are, and remember that a question usually ends with a question mark. So who is going to start us off out there? Mark?
I have a question. I've been very...
Who are you?
Sorry, I'm Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center. I have a question. I've been quite curious to hear your views on, given your writings, but also given the theme of this talk. So one of the debates that's been going on is China on the brink of possibly a balance sheet recession? And so Richard Koo, who termed this, has said that China is at high risk, and that's because Chinese firms are increasingly in this type of low interest rate, possibly deflationary scenario, looking to repair their balance sheets and not borrowing at nearly the rates necessary to fuel the investments that the government might be seeking. And in August, we saw signs for the first time, right, that bank lending was lower and actually contracting for the first time in over 2 decades. So I'm just curious, based on the firms that you oversee through your research, what percentage today do you think are behaving like firms in a balance sheet recession scenario? And what percent over the next 3 to 5 years, if growth proceeds at this sort of 4 or 5% rate, given the debt levels that they have, might look to be repairing their balance sheets as opposed to borrowing more and adding on debt to make investments? In other words, I'm just asking not so much to make a prediction on balance sheet recession, is it likely to happen or not, but since you do the research specific to firms, what percentage of firms today are behaving that way, and what percentage of firms over the next 3 or 5 years are likely to begin behaving that way? Thanks.
So that's way too scientific for me. And also, I haven't been focusing on Chinese companies. I would just say that number one, the international interest rate environment is not advantageous to China right now. So I would expect U.S. interest rates to rise and Chinese interest rates to continue low and to continue down, and that means that it's very difficult. I think also the renminbi is under a tremendous amount of pressure. I think that the answer is Probably yes, already in a balance sheet recession. Certainly yes, going into more of a balance sheet recession. Whether that leads to, what that specifically leads to, how acute it becomes is very hard to say. I always have a negative view, but then I have had a negative view for a long time, so I'm not really sure. I would say basically yes, not good.
Hi, my name is Dominik Sachsenmeier from the University of Göttingen, but currently at the Weatherhead Center. Just my question is about the option of switching to a consumer economy that's very often debated as a way out of the crisis, right? And it's portrayed as a viable option. I just wonder if that's really the case. I mean, given the parameters of the fiscal constraints, aging population, high youth unemployment, housing crisis, and so forth. So would actually this shift be a realistic option for the Chinese government at the moment?
Want me to take that? You want to take it? I think that when people talk about a consumer-led economy, they often think of the U.S. and they think in judgmental terms about, credit card, swiping credit cards too often, borrowing too much money, this. But the way I think of it is, dictators want as much production and as little consumption as possible. And that is, because that means more benefits for the people at the top of the economy. I think that's, I could have plenty of comments about the U.S. economy in that regard as well. But at any rate, I think that that consumption is more desirable from an economic point of view. I think it's less desirable from a political control point of view, and therefore almost 0% chance of happening. The only possibility that China becomes more consumption-oriented is that China has a political change. And so that would be surprising and radical. Under Xi Jinping, it's simply not going to happen. Consumption has already been declining as a portion of GDP, and I think is destined to continue to decline.
Yeah, I would agree with that it might be considered desirable for the economy, but politically is extremely difficult to bring about for the kind of points that Anne was making, that you also, to be able to stimulate the consumption in the economy, you've got to be able to reduce the savings. And if you don't have an effective infrastructure for welfare, for healthcare, pensions, et cetera, people are still going to keep saving. And one of the things that is quite clear is that the Chinese government does not believe in politics of redistribution. It has always resisted that. Its fiscal system is extremely regressive, favoring elites and favoring the wealthy, and none of that would encourage a shift to a more consumer and consumption-driven economy. And where we talk about consumption, a lot of it is state consumption, of course, not individual households to a large extent.
You also have to have stuff to spend money. Sorry, you have to have stuff to spend money on. So, the number of Chinese people I know who are moving to Canada and the United States in order to get their children out of that educational system is really very high. And I think that, being able to choose your educational system, being able to access better quality health care, better quality financial services, being able to travel. There's a lot of crackdown on people leaving China right now. Those are all consumption items, and they're being reduced now.
I'm Tom Palmer, former journalist. We've heard of 3 very recent civil disobedience incidents. I gather there are a lot that happened that we don't hear about. Do you think those are directly related to the dysfunction of the economy there and the lack of a positive future?
I'd ask Tony to comment on this, but my view is no. I think there was plenty of civil disobedience and dissatisfaction during the financial crisis. There was plenty before that during the reform of the state-owned enterprises and the unemployment of roughly 50 million people. It never cohered into a national idea or into probably the most dangerous type of civil disobedience in the most recent era in China has been property price decreases. because people who already own those same complexes get very upset when they think the market prices of their property are declining. But and we've had several protests around that sort of issue. Those protests have failed to cohere into a general dissatisfaction. And my feeling is that if the Shanghai lockdowns, which created, tremendous hardship and dissatisfaction, if those didn't create a general, revolution, nothing will until Xi Jinping is gone. What do you think, Tony?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm not sure what the three civil disobedience events are you're talking about. Whether they're the very individualistic things with the
Zhuhai thing?
The cars.
And then one cabin.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, those are just very recent. I gather there are others too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, those are very individualistic, and you've often had those kinds of cases where individuals are frustrated with the way a decision has gone, a court decision, or they've lost a job. I mean, those are kind of extreme, but we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years other bouts of those kinds of influences. I think sometimes you get copycat phenomenon. So the second person driving the car might have seen the first person, think they take revenge in that way. But I think, Anne's right. There's never been anything that's really kind of consolidated into a movement that would threaten the regime. And the nature of the protest has shifted over time. There was, of course, the big layoffs at the end of the 90s. We don't really know, 50 to 70 million people laid off. What I heard then when I was traveling a lot in areas like the Northeast, there was, in that particular case, there was a lot of resignation. Look, this state-owned enterprise, it doesn't work. We know something's got to happen. I just hope that whatever comes out of it is going to be better for my kids. And so a lot of people were willing to let go on that. Then, of course, you saw in the countryside, demonstrations shifting. It was over taxes, then it was over land acquisition, and so on and so forth. But it never really, I think, gained any, strong momentum to challenge the authorities in significant ways. But it did, I think, in each of those cases, produce a policy response from the leadership. So they were aware of what people were protesting about. So if you think about, the layoffs in the state-owned enterprises, that was when the Jiang Zemin Zhu Rongji leadership decided to build a welfare structure that would give support to the urban working class. It ignored the rural people, so on and so forth. And then when you see Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, once they begin to take over, they do respond. The agricultural tax gets abolished, for example. They do try and bring in better regulations to manage land acquisition and so on. And so in that sense, the center is responsive. They also, with the protests now around housing, where a lot of people have bought houses that haven't been built or haven't been finished, the leadership has tried to put in measures to financially compensate for them. And they're reducing things, on loans, mortgages, and so on, reducing the repayments on those. So, they know what's happening, and often they do respond if it gets to a certain level. Yeah, please.
I'm actually less pessimistic towards Chinese economy. Myself as entrepreneur in China and as a private equity investor working with very late stage companies. From outside in, it's very easy to say, oh, China is so chaotic. But at the end of the day, China goes through this chaos and then order, chaos and order. We just grow out of this. The resilience is incredible. If you look at, the issues that Em just talked about, on one way we can say that's abuses, but on the other side we can call it creativity. So in terms of where we are, I think where a lot of judgment comes from is people try to use your framework in assessing China, but China never grows with the same framework as the Western world. Look at 1989, that's the biggest criticism of Western world towards China. And at the time, the students wanted, they wanted democracy, they didn't even know what democracy really meant at the time. And if China didn't go through, what they wanted, but China created a miracle. So I guess when we assess China, let's try not to use the same framework, because every framework has its own limitations and weaknesses and advantages. So I guess China will come out to be something very different again, maybe surprising all of us. And in terms of Mark's question, I mean, from my point of view, I think that's a balancing force, because Chinese companies borrowing so much. So this is another force forcing these companies to create cash flows for themselves. So it's really balancing. It really depends on which view you're looking at it. So I'm less pessimistic. I wouldn't call it optimistic, but I wouldn't be so, battering on China that much. So that's just my comments. It's not actually a question.
No, it's fine.
I think one thing that's been a saving grace is actually inventiveness of the Chinese people rather than the Chinese government. And I think most of the issues that you're talking about have often come about in spite of what government is trying to do. And it is creative. I mean, I think the examples that Anne was giving is phenomenal creativity. Give me a bill for 100 million and it only costs $1 million. And I mean, that's genuine creativity. So, so in that sense, I don't know whether it's applying a Western standard or a Chinese standard. I'm not 100% convinced that that is the kind of answer to it, because yes, there's tremendous resilience within Chinese society, and one has to accept that because the Communist Party is being persistent in its rule, it is also extremely resilient. I think the question becomes, though, do you get to a point where that way of developing reaches its natural endpoint and the natural course? Then I think the interesting question becomes, well, then what does happen next? Can the state manufacture another miracle? Or are you looking to society and the incredible inventiveness and dynamism in Chinese society to push that forward? My own bet would be the latter is better than the former, but I don't think we know.
Mitch Presnick, visiting fellow here at the Fairbanks Center. Hi, Anne. It's so nice to see you. We're old friends. And in fact, I think you were probably the first Western business person who let me come to their office and gave me a briefing way back when I was a student at Beida. So
yet if later on I had actually joined you in business, as we discussed, then I'd be an awful lot richer now.
Yeah, you've always been a sage. I had a question for you, because my research, my research, and I sent you my article. It kind of looks at, okay, that's all true, and yet look what they're producing. Look at the number of areas of critical technology that they are dominant in. Look at how they've taken, shipbuilding, EVs, high-speed rail, digital infrastructure. Oh, I'm running out of fingers. And you go, is it maybe a Schrodinger's cat economy where it's both doing poorly and perhaps coming to the end of its cycle of what it can achieve with the current model, or even a modified model? Or is it simultaneously something else, with a country that's vibrant, with more STEM grads being produced than the rest of the world combined, with a brand new infrastructure that creates total factor productivity gains, and then of course now they've got all of these ever increasing connections into the developing world, and just the other day President Xi opens a port. $3.5 billion port. I mean, so which story? What happens after the Chinese miracle if both of these are true? Because I don't know which is true and which is false, but I know that they both probably are true to a certain degree. So what does that mean? What is the actual next? What does the next step look like?
Well, that's pretty broad. I would just make a couple of comments. The first comment is, imagine what those things might be without the Chinese bureaucracy on top of them. So what China is particularly good at is making things making things thriftily, making things very cheap and commoditizing them. So this is, for example, what happened with the solar industry, and why the solar industry all migrated to China and essentially, eliminated Wacker and Hemlock and REC and all the foreign companies. I mean, most of them still exist, but they're not real factors the way the massive exporters of LDK and STP and, Yingli and so forth were. Where are those companies now? Dead, right? Solar has gotten a lot cheaper and it's become a Chinese dominated thing, but where are those particular companies? Dead. And where is solar innovation? Not in China, right? And the same is true of EVs and batteries. If you take away the subsidies from EVs and battery technology, then you really don't have a lot of Chinese industry. And what you do have is massive cost reduction in these technologies, so that will they be? I mean, let me give you a case that I've probably bored you with in the past, but this is when I was I was first in China. Is cell phones, hand phones, right? So China got, it used to be that Motorola and Nokia dominated the hand phone business. They hardly exist anymore. I think and they exist, but not in hand phones. Anyway, so China's bureaucracy was upset about this, and they wanted to change it. So they decided, okay, we're going to fund R&D for Chinese domestic cell phones. And the metric is if you export, then you're winning, right? So they did create a whole lot of, explosion in Chinese exports, and Motorola and Nokia lost their positions as number one and number two. And you got these companies like Kejian and Konka and Panda and HEC's, cell phone division, all becoming, massive exporters. But meanwhile, the LCD screen, the chipset, the software, the form factor all became technologies overseas. And Chinese manufacturers essentially imported kits from either Korea or France and then packed them into a plastic case and sold that. So they drove down the price and they got right off the technology curve. So, are they important? Yes, important, because they did export a lot of, really cheap things. Are they technologically innovative? No. So first of all, I would question, obviously Chinese companies can innovate. The great innovation is in driving down cost and arbitraging regulatory inefficiencies in order to make money, as in the example of the slaughterhouse. The second piece of it is something that Tony alluded to, which is you still have 60% of the country which has education levels lower than Algeria by international standards, health standards that are lower than Mexico, just all down the line, who are living like third world country people. And, meanwhile, you have people in Shanghai and Beijing who, have 50 times as much wealth as we do, like the average person, right? That's not right. And that's been maintained through the system of hukou, which is essentially a system of maintaining a large, cheap, backwoods labor force as if you had your own Bangladesh sitting in your backyard. So is that right? No. And is that maintained by the party? Yes.
Yeah, I think this conundrum is what makes China endlessly fascinating, and also related to what you're saying. You can't really draw a simple conclusion because it is such a mix of different things happening at the same time. I thought, on your question, this relates, I think, to Anne's point. Yasheng Huang, I think, has written very well on this, about what he talks about, kind of the outsourcing for innovation, whether it's bringing foreign companies into China, whether it's sending your people overseas to study, bringing that technology and knowledge back, which is where a lot of these tech companies originally developed from. And then what you give them is you give them scale. You then give them a market of 1.4 billion, and you put protective walls around them, so they don't, they're not competing with other global companies in those areas. And that's what has driven, I think, a lot of that kind of success. Then it raises the interesting question if, as is happening increasingly, and I think will continue under a Trump presidency, if China gets more and more isolated in terms of being able to engage globally around forefront technologies, can it really keep that lead, and can it have sufficient innovation within country? Now, some areas I think is doing that. Some of the areas in the platform economies, yes, it does seem to be. But as far as I can see, and it's not my area, genuinely breakthrough new technologies have not happened in China. They've often been kind of iterations of it, applications of it, scaling of it, but not the actual breakthrough technology itself.
Yeah, and it's really clear why. I mean, in the early 2000s, I got so that if people would invite me to talk about Chinese, domestic, what they call it, domestic innovation, anyway, whatever word they had for that, I felt like I would much rather have a root canal. It's just like, yes, obviously Chinese people are inventive and Chinese people invent fascinating things, but the bureaucracy, most, for example, which used to be in charge, is kind of half in charge of under Jiang Zemin, it was very much in charge of tactical, targets, had a list on its website until it became unpopular to do that, of technologies that you should replicate in order to get subsidies. So, the Pentium 2 chip and the, whatever, chip for a set-top box. And so what you had is you had Chinese companies competing to redo these technologies 2 to 5 years late. So they wouldn't have a market compared with the world leader, which had already moved on, but they could make them 40% cheaper. So along with subsidies, they could sell them in the countryside. So this is the story of, for example, of Haier. This is what, a lot of what Haier did in its research institutes. It's part of what Lenovo did before Lenovo, hooked onto IBM and broke free. Is it a useful thing to do? I mean, yeah, you can sell an awful lot of HEC phones in Nigeria, but is it really innovative? No. And also, does it increase total factor productivity? No. And I think if you look at those numbers, you'll see they've gone backwards recently.
Okay, given time that's left to be the last question.
No, go ahead. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm a PhD student in education here. I have a question. I'm really curious about your methods. You're aware accessing sources in China is increasingly not as straightforward. Can you share some secret with us? How do you make sure your findings are reflecting actually what's going on the ground? Do you do on the ground research or do more Zoom interview? Which I'm just really curious because I'm also doing comparative studies and I find it not very straightforward. Thank you.
You're asking me. I mean, since I've left China and particularly since 2018 or so, it's become extremely difficult. So around 2017-18, I was relying on Chinese staff and Chinese friends in order to provide information, and also you could still access databases. But from beginning in early 2018, China made most databases off limits to foreigners. So we, for example, we used to use Zhaopin and various hiring companies. They would make their databases of resumes available on a statistical level. And so you could search, for example, what's the average salary of somebody seeking a software job in Hefei. But you can't do that anymore. You could get customs data by the name of the company, but they made that off limits. You could get you could access the tax documents of a company as long as you went through a certain process. You could access the AIC documents, which are sort of higher level financials. You could access, there was a whole lot of information that was available then that's really not available now. Now, even CN Info I was trying to access, Chinese financials of listed companies yesterday, and I just couldn't get past it. So, you can use a VPN, but basically you need to have friends in China. I mean, even to sign in to something like, I I don't know, one of the SAIC databases we use, I have to use a Chinese-based cell phone and usually facial recognition. So when they'll cut me off, who knows?
All right, I'm afraid we're at the bewitching hour, but please join me in thanking Anne for a very spirited discussion.